Welcome to Pully Ministries Audio Bible. This particular installment is actually not the Bible at all. And the works herein are not scripture or any part of the Bible. Rather, they're the works of a famous first century Jewish historian by the name of Flavius Josephus. I'm going to read you the first couple of chapters of the Antiquities of the Jews, or the History of the Jews. It was written by Josephus, and I'm going to read the preface first. So I'm going to, instead of telling you his story, I'm just going to let you derive what you can from that, because it's pretty self-explanatory. So he's a first century historian living in Rome, and he undertook to write the history of the Jewish people for the Greeks and other non-Jewish Hebrew-speaking people. And here in the first chapter he explains why. So I'm going to start with that. I'm looking forward to this. This is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. Right now I'm supposed to be finishing the Wisdom of Solomon from the Apocrypha, but I just really wanted to get this one started. So here we go. Those who undertake to write histories do not, I perceive, take that trouble on one and the same account, but for many reasons, and those such are very different one from another. For some of them apply themselves to this part of learning to show their skill in composition, and that they may therein acquire a reputation for speaking finely. Others of them there are who write histories in order to gratify those that happen to be concerned in them, and on that account have spared no pains, but rather go beyond their own abilities in the performance. But others there are who of necessity and by force are driven to write history because they are concerned in the facts, and so cannot excuse themselves from committing them to writing, for the advantage of posterity. Nay, there are not a few who are induced to draw the historical facts out of darkness into light, and to produce them for the benefit of the public on account of the great importance of the facts themselves with which they have been concerned. Now, of these several reasons for writing history, I must profess that the last two were my own reasons also. For since I myself was interested in that war which we Jews had with the Romans, and knew myself its particular actions, and what conclusion it had, I was forced to give the history of it, because I saw that others perverted the truth of those actions in their writings. Now I have undertaken the present work, as thinking it will appear to all the Greeks worthy of their study, for it will contain all our Antiquities, and the constitution of our government, as interpreted out of the Hebrew Scriptures. And indeed I did formerly intend, when I wrote of the war, to explain who the Jews originally were, what fortunes they had been subjected to, and by what legislator they had been instructed in piety, and the exercise of other virtues. What wars also they had made in remote ages, till they were unwillingly engaged in this last one with the Romans. But because this work would take up a great compass, I separated it into a set treatise by itself, with a beginning of its own, and its own conclusion. But in process of time, as usually happens to such as undertake great writings, I grew weary, and went on slowly, it being a large subject, and a difficult thing to translate our history into a foreign, and to us, unaccustomed language. However, some persons there were who desired to know our history, and so exhorted me to go on with it. And above all the rest, Epaphroditus, a man who is a lover of all kind of learning, but is principally delighted with the knowledge of history, and this on account of his having been himself concerned in great affairs, and many turns of fortune, and having shown a wonderful vigor of an excellent nature, and an immovable virtuous resolution in them all. I yielded to this man's persuasions, who always excite such as have abilities in what is useful and acceptable, to join their endeavors with his. I was also ashamed myself to permit any laziness of disposition to have a greater influence upon me than the delight of taking pains in such studies as were very useful. I thereupon stirred up myself, and went on with my work more cheerfully. Besides the foregoing motives, I had others which I greatly reflected on, and these were, that our forefathers were willing to communicate such things to others, and that some of the Greeks took considerable pains to know the affairs of our nation. I found, therefore, that the second of the Ptolemies was a king who was extraordinarily diligent in what concerned learning and the collection of books, that he was also peculiarly ambitious to procure a translation of our law and the constitution of our government therein contained into the Greek tongue. Now Eleazar, the high priest, one not inferior to any other of that dignity among us, did not envy the forenamed king in participation of that advantage, which otherwise he would for certain have denied him, but that he knew the custom of our nation was to hinder nothing of what we esteemed ourselves from being communicated to others. Accordingly, I thought it became me both to imitate the generosity of our high priest, and to suppose there might even now be many lovers of learning like the king. For he did not obtain all our writings at that time, but those who were sent to Alexandria as interpreters gave him only the books of the law, while there were a vast number of other matters in our sacred books. They indeed contained in them the history of 5,000 years, in which time happened many strange accidents, many chances of war, and great actions of the commanders, and mutations of the form of our government. Upon the whole, a man that will peruse this history may principally learn from it, that all events succeed well, even to an incredible degree, and the reward of felicity is proposed by God. But then it is to those who follow his will, and do not venture to break his excellent laws, and that so far as men anyway apostatize from the accurate observation of them, what was practicable before becomes impracticable, and whatsoever they set out about as a good thing is converted into an incurable calamity. And now I exhort all those who peruse these books to apply their minds to God, and to examine the mind of our legislator, whether he hath understood his nature in a manner worthy of him, and hath not ever ascribed to him such operations as become his power, and hath not preserved his writings from those indecent fables which others have framed, although by the great distance of time when he lived, he might have securely forged such lies, for he lived 2,000 years ago, at which vast distance of ages the poets themselves have not been so hardy as to fix even the generations of their gods, much less the actions of their men or their own laws. As I proceed, therefore, I shall accurately describe what is contained in our records, in the order of time that belongs to them, for I have already promised to do so throughout this undertaking, and this without adding anything to what is therein contained, or taking away anything therefrom. But because almost all of our constitution depends on the wisdom of Moses, our legislator, I cannot avoid saying somewhat concerning him beforehand, though I shall do it briefly. I mean, because otherwise those that read my book may wonder how it comes to pass that my discourse, which promises an account of laws and historical facts, contains so much of philosophy. The reader is therefore to know that Moses deemed it exceeding necessary that he who would conduct his own life well, and give laws to others, in the first place should consider the divine nature, and upon the contemplation of God's operations, should thereby imitate the best of all patterns, so far it is possible for human nature to do, and to endeavor to follow after it. Neither could the legislator himself have a right mind without such a contemplation, nor would anything he should write tend to be the promotion of virtue in his readers. I mean, unless they be taught first of all that God is the Father and Lord of all things, and sees all things, and that thence he bestows a happy life upon those that follow him, but plunges such as do not walk in the paths of virtue into inevitable miseries. Now when Moses was desirous to teach this lesson to his countrymen, he did not begin the establishment of his laws after the same manner that the other legislators did. I mean, upon contracts and other rights between one man and another, but by raising their minds upwards to regard God, and his creation of the world, and persuading them that we men are the most excellent of the creatures of God upon earth. Now when once he had brought them to submit to religion, he easily persuaded them to submit in all other things. For as to other legislators, they followed fables, and by their discourses transferred the most reproachful of human vices unto the gods, and so afforded wicked men the most plausible excuses for their crimes. But, as for our legislator, when he had once demonstrated that God was possessed of perfect virtue, he supposed that man also ought to strive after the participation of it. And on those who did not think so, believe he inflicted the severest punishments. I exhort therefore my readers to examine this whole undertaking in that view, For thereby it will appear to them that there is nothing therein disagreeable either to the majesty of God, or to his love to mankind. For all things have here a reference to the nature of the universe, while our legislators speak some things wisely, but enigmatically, and others under a decent allegory, which still explain such things as required a direct explanation plainly and expressively. However, those that have a mind to know the reason of everything may find here a very curious philosophical theory, which I now indeed shall waive the explication of. But if God afford me time for it, I will set about writing it after I have finished this present work. I shall now betake myself to the history before me, after I have first mentioned what Moses says of the creation of the world, which I find described in the sacred books after the manner following. So there Josephus gives his reason for writing the Antiquities of the Jews. And then it begins. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. But when the earth did not come into sight, but was covered up with thick darkness, and a wind moved upon its surface, God commanded that there should be light. And when that was made, he considered the whole mass, and separated the light and the darkness, and the name he gave to one was night, and the other he called day. And he named the beginning of light and the time of rest, the evening and the morning. And this was indeed the first day. But Moses said it was one day, the cause of which I am able to give even now. But because I have promised to give such reasons for all things in a treatise by itself, I shall put off its exposition till that time. After this, on the second day, he placed the heaven over the whole world, and separated it from the other parts, and he determined it should stand by itself. He also placed a crystalline firmament round it, and put it together in a manner agreeable to the earth, and fitted it for the giving moisture and rain, and for affording the advantage of dews. On the third day he appointed the dry land to appear, with the sea itself round about it. And on the very same day he made the plants and the seeds to spring out of the earth. On the fourth day he adorned the heaven with the sun, the moon, and the other stars, and appointed them their motions and courses, that the vicissitudes of the seasons might be clearly signified. And on the fifth day he produced the living creatures, both those that swim and those that fly, the former in the sea, the latter in the air. He also sorted them as to society and mixture, for procreation, that their kinds might increase and multiply. On the sixth day he created the 4-footed beasts, and made them male and female. And on the same day he also formed man. Accordingly, Moses says that in just 6 days the world and all that is therein was made, and that the seventh day was a rest, and a release from the labor of such operations. Whence it is that we celebrate a rest from our labors on that day, and call it the Sabbath, which word denotes rest in the Hebrew tongue. Moreover, Moses, after the seventh day was over, begins to talk philosophically, and concerning the formation of man says thus, that God took dust from the ground, and formed man, inserted in him a spirit and a soul. This man was called Adam, which in the Hebrew tongue signifies one that is red, because he was formed out of the red earth, compounded together, for of that kind is virgin and true earth. God also presented the living creatures when he had made them, according to their kinds, both male and female, to Adam, who gave them those names by which they are still called. But when he saw that Adam had no female companion, no society, for there was no such created, and that he wondered at the other animals which were male and female, he laid him asleep, and took away one of his ribs, and out of it formed the woman. Whereupon Adam knew her when she was brought to him, and acknowledged that she was made out of himself. Now a woman is called in the Hebrew tongue Issa, but the name of this woman was Eve, which signifies the mother of all living. Moses says further that God planted a paradise in the east, flourishing with all sorts of trees, and that among them was the tree of life, and another of knowledge, whereby was to be known what was good and evil. And that when he brought Adam and his wife into the garden, he commanded them to take care of the plants. Now the garden was watered by one river, which ran round about the whole earth, and was parted into 4 parts. And Pison, which denotes a multitude, running into India, makes its exit into the sea, and is by the Greeks called Ganges. Euphrates also, as well as Tigris, goes down into the Red Sea. Now the name Euphrates, or Phrath, denotes either a dispersion or a flower. By Tigris or Diglath is signified what is swift, with narrowness, and Gihon runs through Egypt, and denotes what arises from the east, which the Greeks call the Nile. God therefore commanded that Adam and his wife should eat of all the rest of the plants, but to abstain from the tree of knowledge, and foretold to them that if they touched it, it would prove their destruction. But while all the living creatures had one language, at that time the serpent, which then lived together with Adam and his wife, showed an envious disposition, and at his opposal of their living happily, and in obedience to the commands of God, and imagining that when they disobeyed them they would fall into calamities, he persuaded the woman out of a malicious intention to taste the tree of knowledge, telling them that in the tree was the knowledge of good and evil, which knowledge, when they should obtain, they would lead a happy life, nay, a life not inferior to that of a god, by which means he overcame the woman and persuaded her to despise the command of God. Now when she had tasted that of the tree, and was pleased with its fruit, she persuaded Adam to make use of it also. Upon this they perceived that they were become naked to one another. And being ashamed to thus appear abroad, they invented somewhat to cover them. For the tree sharpened their understanding, and they covered themselves with fig leaves, and tying these before them out of modesty, they thought they were happier than they were before, as they had discovered what they were in want of. But when God came into the garden, Adam, who was wont before to come and converse with him, being conscious of his wicked behavior, went out of the way. This behavior surprised God, and he asked what was the cause of his procedure, and why he, that before delighted in that conversation, did now fly from it and avoid it. When he made no reply, as conscious to himself that he had transgressed the command of God, God said, I had before determined about you both, how you might lead a happy life, without any affliction, and care, and vexation of the soul, and that all things which might contribute to your enjoyment and pleasure should grow up by my providence, of their own accord, without your own labor and painstaking, which state of labor and painstaking would soon bring on old age, and death would not be at any remote distance. But now thou hast abused this my good will, and hast disobeyed my commands. For thy silence is not the sign of thy virtue, but of thy evil conscience. However, Adam excused his sin, and entreated God not to be angry with him, and laid the blame of what was done upon his wife, and said that he was deceived by her, and thence became an offender, while she again accused the serpent. But God allotted him punishment, because he weakly submitted to the counsel of his wife, and said, the ground should not henceforth yield its fruits of its own accord, but that when it should be harassed by their labor, it should bring forth some of its fruits, and refuse to bring forth others. He also made Eve liable to the inconveniency of breeding, and the sharp pains of bringing forth children, and this because she persuaded Adam with the same arguments wherewith the serpent had persuaded her, and had thereby brought him into a calamitous condition. He also deprived the serpent of speech, out of indignation at his malicious disposition towards Adam. Besides this, he inserted poison under his tongue, and made him an enemy to man, and suggested to them that they should direct their strokes against his head, that being the place wherein lay his mischievous designs towards men, and it being the easiest to take vengeance on him that way. And when he had deprived him of the use of his feet, it made him go rolling all along, and dragging himself upon the ground. And when God had appointed these penalties for them, he removed Adam and Eve out of the garden into another place. Adam and Eve had 2 sons. The elder of them was named Cain, which name, when it is interpreted, signifies a possession. The younger was Abel, which signifies sorrow. They had also daughters. Now the 2 brethren were pleased with different courses for life. For Abel, the younger, was a lover of righteousness, and believing that God was present at all his actions, he excelled in virtue, and his employment was that of a shepherd. But Cain was not only very wicked in other respects, but was wholly intent upon getting, and he first contrived to plough the ground. He slew his brother on the occasion following. They had resolved to sacrifice to God. Now Cain brought forth the fruits of the earth in his husbandry, but Abel brought milk in the first fruits of his flocks. But God was more delighted with the latter oblation, when he was honored with that which grew naturally of its own accord, than he was with the invention of a covetous man, and gotten by forcing the ground. Whence it was that Cain was very angry that Abel was preferred by God before him, and slew his brother, and hid his dead body, thinking to escape discovery. But God, knowing what had been done, came to Cain, and asked him what was become of his brother, because he had not seen him of many days, whereas he used to observe them conversing together at other times. But Cain was in doubt with himself, and knew not what answer to give God. At first he said that he himself was at a loss about his brother's disappearing. But when he was provoked by God, who pressed him vehemently, as resolving to know what the matter was, he replied he was not his brother's guardian nor keeper, nor was he an observer of what he did. But in return God convicted Cain, as having been the murderer of his brother, and said, I wonder at thee, that thou knowest not what is become of a man whom thou thyself hast destroyed. God therefore did not inflict the punishment of death upon him, on account of his offering sacrifice, and thereby making supplication to him not to be extreme in his wrath to him. But he made him accursed, and threatened his posterity in the 7th generation. He also cast him, together with his wife, out of that land. And when he was afraid that in wandering about he should fall among wild beasts, and by that means perish, God bid him not to entertain such a melancholy suspicion, and to go over all the earth without fear of what mischief he might suffer from wild beasts. And setting a mark upon him that might be known, he commanded him to depart. And when Cain had travelled all over many countries, he with his wife built a city named Nod, which is a place so called, and there he settled his abode, where also he had children. However, he did not accept of his punishment, in order to amendment, but to increase his wickedness. For he only aimed to procure everything that was for his own bodily pleasure, though it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbors. He augmented his household substance with much wealth, by rapine and violence. He excited his acquaintance to procure pleasures and spoils by robbery, and became a great leader of men into wicked courses. He also introduced a change in the way of simplicity, wherein men lived before, and was the author of measures and weights. And whereas they lived innocently and generously while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world into cunning craftiness. He first of all set boundaries about lands. He built a city and fortified it with walls, and he compelled his family to come together to it, and called that city Enoch, after the name of his eldest son Enoch. Now Jared was the son of Enoch, whose son was Malaleel, whose son was Methuselah, whose son was Lamech, who had 77 children by 2 wives, Silla and Ada. Of those children by Ada, one was Jabal. He erected tents, and loved the life of a shepherd. But Jubal, who was born of the same mother with him, exercised himself in music, and invented the psaltery and the harp. But Jubal, one of his children by the other wife, exceeded all men in strength, and was very expert and famous in martial performances. He procured what tended to the pleasures of the body by that method, and first of all invented the art of making brass. Lamech, who was also the father of a daughter, whose name was Naamah, and because he was so skillful in matters of divine revelation, that he knew he was to be punished for Cain's murder of his brother, he made that known to his wives. Nay, even while Adam was alive, it came to pass that the posterity of Cain became exceeding wicked, every one successively dying one after the other, more wicked than the former. They were intolerable in war, and vehement in robberies. And if anyone was slow to murder people, yet was he bold in his profligate behavior, in acting unjustly and doing injuries for gain. Now Adam, who was the first man, and made out of the earth, for our discourse must now be about him, after Abel was slain, and Cain fled away on account of his murder, was solicitous for posterity, and had a vehement desire of children, he being 230 years old, after which time he lived other 700, and then died. He had indeed many other children, but Seth in particular. As for the rest, it would be tedious to name them. I will therefore only endeavor to give an account of those that proceeded from Seth. Now this Seth, when he was brought up, and came to those years in which he could discern what was good, became a virtuous man. And as he was himself of an excellent character, so did he leave children behind him who imitated his virtues. All of these proved to be of good dispositions. They also inhabited the same country without dissensions, and in a happy condition, without any misfortunes falling upon them till they died. They were also the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies in their order, and that their inventions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known, upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire, and at another time by the violence and quantity of water. They made 2 pillars, the one of brick and the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them both, that in case the pillar or brick should be destroyed by the flood, the pillar or stone might remain, and exhibit those discoveries to mankind, and also informed them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. Now this remains in the land of Syriad to this day. I was going to read the first 5 chapters, but we're now hitting on about 25 minutes, which is, probably more time than anybody has to watch this stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed this so far. Again, Flavius Josephus, first century Jewish historian, who wrote quite a bit of history about the Jews from his own time, but also set out to write their history from the beginning. Which, as you can tell, most of it is the story you've heard many times in your life. It's the Bible. But you can also tell that there's just the language that's special to me that Flavius Josephus uses that just makes it a little more interesting. It puts a little tinge on it that you haven't heard before. Going into depth there about Cain and Seth and Adam and just tiny little tidbits that aren't in the Bible, and basically the same story just told by another person. And for me, it just gives a whole new life to it, and just reinvigorates you into reading it and wanting to. So I've been meaning to share this for a long time. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm gonna stop there at the end of chapter 2, and we will continue this later. Hopefully you'll tune in and see how it differentiates from the Old Testament in the next couple of chapters. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you later.